Bismillah wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, dear listeners. We have a very special episode lined up for you. I always say that, but today is really special because I'm podcasting first thing in the morning. I don't think I've actually done something like that before, but it is what it is. Our guest today, I usually bring up a profile picture, but today I kind of don't have that because I want people to be as shocked as he was when he saw me for the first time. Let me bring him up right to your screen. Ladies and gentlemen, I did not clone myself. This is not the trickery of technology. This is an actual other person, and as you can see on your screen, his name is MJ Khan. Brother MJ, welcome to Botswana. Have you ever been here before?
Assalamu alaikum. No, I have not had the pleasure of being in Botswana yet, but it's definitely on my bucket list.
Okay, wa alaikum salam, mashallah. So, this is your first time in Botswana, albeit virtually. So, just to give you a little rundown on what brother MJ does here. So, basically, and he will expand upon this, he is responsible for a lot of things to do with social media. In fact, before social media was an actual term that people like you and me started using, MJ already knew what stuff like that was because it was part of his research and everything. And until today, it's part of his job. He lectures around various places and he works at Sasol, particularly focused on social media and all these things. And that will kind of play into our discussion today. But, brother MJ, let's start here. What does MJ stand for? And yeah, did you just decide to start calling yourself that, or was that someone else's decision?
So it's actually a fun game I play with people. It's a lot like I'm not sure whether you've seen The Dark Knight, the second Batman movie in the Chris Nolan trilogy. And each time the Joker meets someone and he tells them, do you know how I got these scars? And each time it's a different story. So whenever anyone asks me, what does MJ stand for? I always try and switch it up a little bit just to have fun. So some days I'm Mary Jane, and other days I'm Michael Jordan. Some days Mila Jovovich, and some days Montel Jordan, or whatever it is. I could be Mustaqim perhaps tomorrow, Mustaqim Javed.
Wow.
So in reality, MJ stands for Muhammad Junaid, and so as you articulated in your opening, I do a lot of lecturing, and sometimes the classes are quite large. So it's upwards of 600 to 1,000 students in some of the bigger lecture venues, and I find that as a lecturer, it was easier if the students just knew me as MJ. So it kind of just stuck about 14 years ago, and I've been going with it ever since. So yeah, Muhammad Junaid is my name, but MJ is the name that everyone sort of knows me as.
Oh, mashallah, mashallah. So, brother MJ, you basically, as you've already reiterated, you lecture around South Africa on social media and all these other topics. But as you mentioned in our pre recorded conversation, that you had been playing with this term social media since at least 2005 when many of these big giants, Facebook was just a year old at that time. I don't know what was happening with Twitter, but Snapchat definitely did not exist. And, well, it's debatable whether it still exists right now with the amount of people that actually use it. But why don't you tell us what it was like in those early years? What was social media? I mean, back then it must have been such a technical thing that only nerds and geniuses in some back room over there fiddled with and stuff like that. It wasn't something that the ordinary person talked about. So, what's your take on the whole evolution of social media, how it just exploded across all borders?
Hmm. So yeah, back in the early days, I mean, it was quite a fascinating thing because it really was a shift in power. So for those who are listening to your podcast or watching the podcast who are familiar with communication studies, they know that the traditional model of communication used to be a sender, a message, and receiver, and the power would lie with the sender, so the source, whether that source is a big media company or radio, whatever it is. What's happened though with the rise of the internet and digitalization is that you have what we call Web 2.0, where the content that we see, the content that we consume online, is content that we create ourselves. So if you reflect on, for example, your Instagram page, that is populated with content that you yourself create or curate. And that really is the shift in the thinking and the consumption, where the power itself was sort of wrested away from your traditional media houses and then put in the hands of the everyday man, where we can now become content creators. In fact, what we're doing right now with this podcast is a great example of that, where we have wrested that power away and we are now creating the content. But we had to have a few things in place in order to do that. And one of the things we needed to do was we needed to figure out digitalization. And digitalization essentially comes down to compression. So if we look at a traditional media platform like radio, radio exists on what is called the electromagnetic spectrum. And there's only a finite amount of that. And that essentially is, if I can make you think back to the days where you had to really dial on a radio to find the right frequency. And that frequency was in between like two areas, and you had all this place in between to play with, but that was about it. When digital came along, it took this finite resource, which is the spectrum, and said, hang on, through compression, we can add so much more choice, we can add so much more variety. Another example would be if you look at terrestrial television and the limitations there in terms of how few channels versus digital television, like the launch of DSTV in South Africa, which I'm sure is quite popular in Botswana as well.
Absolutely,
It
yeah.
really is about opening up the spectrum and allowing more plurality to take place. And that's what we saw. We saw that emerging in the early 2000s. And you really see it fully fledged now, 15 years later, where social media has become so ubiquitous, but it is premised on the idea that it's people self-selecting what they want to consume, but also them creating content and curating content. And that really is part of what I studied back in the day, but it manifests itself so clearly today.
Wow, that is truly amazing. If I may ask, which university was this that actually offered this course on social media, which was such a new thing back then?
Hmm. So back then we didn't even call it social media. It was new media theory. I did my postgraduate studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So when I started, it was called the University of Natal. It then transformed into the University of KwaZulu-Natal. But in my postgraduate years, I did a lot of work with other universities around the world because it was such a new field that we didn't necessarily have the infrastructure to grasp it in UKZN. So a lot of my work was done through the University of Bottle in Washington. A lot of my research came out of the University of Oslo in Norway, and that's really how I've expanded. In fact, I've also done a lot of my research through the University of Auckland, New Zealand. So yeah, in my postgrad years, it was definitely sort of moving around, trying to identify who those thought leaders are in those areas, and trying to understand it from their point of view. Now, that's not to knock my South African lecturers, they were really part and parcel of it. But I think the literature I had to draw in other spaces more than in
Okay,
South Africa.
that makes sense when you explain it that way. That it wasn't just a product of South Africa, and I'm not dissing South Africa, being a Motswana myself, but to understand that it was a collaborative effort from many different universities across the world, that makes more sense to me. So, Brother MJ, seeing how social media has expanded in these last 15 years, how do you think the landscape will change in the coming 15 years? Do you think things like Facebook, Instagram will still be part of people's lives? Will there still be slay queens on TikTok? Or is something else going to take over the scene?
Well, I think what's going to happen really is it's going to become ubiquitous to the point where we don't actually discuss it anymore. Almost like email. Email in
Oh,
and
yeah.
of itself is not remarkable anymore. I mean, go back 2 decades and it was unbelievable in the sense that here's an electronic mail that compresses time, compresses space, and you're able to send data so quickly. But these days, we don't regale and celebrate email anymore. It's routine, it's part of life. It gets absorbed into the thread of humanity. And I think social media is fast becoming like that there, where there's no more fascination around the platform itself. It's just a routine part of life. It's almost like, just part of the ritual of living. I really think that's going to be the shift in terms of social media. Although what is happening again is we are seeing a largely fragmented world in terms of perhaps the rise in let's just say either conservative thinking or the rise in a rise in bigotry that manifests itself online. But again,
Mm.
for us to contextualize that, bigotry has always existed. All social media has done is it's allowed people with like-minded interests to find each other much more easily. So there's always been people who believe that the world is flat. They weren't invented, with the rise of Facebook. All that's
Mm.
happened now is that social media has just allowed them to find each other much more easily, and to sort of create these echo chambers for them to confirm bias. So I think a lot more of that's going to happen, which means that we as responsible citizens really need to be a lot more considered with how we use social media, what we share on social media. And I also think there's going to be a shift again towards privacy. So in the early years, we were very happy to give up our details, because we felt that we were getting something valuable out of it in terms of the personalized experience. But I do think that as we progress, as humanity and as users, we're going to become much more mindful about what we share and what we don't share.
Oh, absolutely. And I was watching an interesting documentary yesterday or the day before about how YouTube has changed in a span of, let's say, 10 years. Once upon a time, YouTube was all about certain creators. So, okay, some of them are still big, such as PewDiePie. I don't know if you remember a guy called Tobuscus. He was also quite big back in the day, but right now he's kind of not relevant anymore. Let's keep it at that. And there have been allegations against him. We won't get into that. But back then, YouTube was not as commercial as it is right now. I mean, today you can go and find all these music videos, for example, which are definitely sponsored by the music labels themselves. Whereas back then, yeah, maybe here and there you'd find a music video that was uploaded illegally, and very few were uploaded by the actual labels themselves. And if they were, then you wouldn't be able to access it from a place like Botswana because you weren't in the States and stuff like that. Back then, it was more about certain personalities and what they bring to the table. Whereas nowadays, YouTube has kind of seen a shift, a growth away from that. And, the whole thing about monetization of your videos and actually making YouTube as your career, that's been something. So, what's your take on the commercialization of YouTube? Do you even agree with that term to begin with?
Well, I think that really brings up an important facet of social media is how do you sustain it, and often the idea is if you're not paying for a service, you are the product, you're being sold. And if you think of something like YouTube, even though they do have a premium experience, most of us offer a free version, which means that we will tolerate the adverts because we know the value of the content that sits behind those adverts. And for all social media platforms really to thrive and to be successful, they do need to introduce monetization policies. It is the way of the world, as these platforms grow, just from a pragmatic perspective, they have servers, they have staff, they have developers, they need to pay these people. And how do you pay it? You pay them by commercializing your revenue. In fact, that's something that both Google does really well, and remember Google does on YouTube, as well as what Facebook does really well, through Instagram and WhatsApp, etc. It is trying to monetize all their platforms so that they stay relevant. The platforms that die are the platforms that cannot effectively monetize because they have to balance between having a subscription and having good quality content, or providing a platform for content creators to thrive. So the natural evolution of YouTube to become commercialized, it is a necessary, I wouldn't say evil, but it's a necessary step in terms of what it
And just
does.
to
Yeah.
interrupt, is this why Snapchat is literally dead right now?
Yeah, I think Snapchat definitely has a problem in terms of that, but also I think with Snapchat is that they were far too niche, and the other platforms have borrowed for them too much. So they've borrowed the best bits of Snapchat and have integrated well with the other bits that Snapchat couldn't offer. So if you think of something like filters, which was really big on Snapchat over the years, the moment Instagram decided to roll out their own version of filters, that effectively killed Snapchat because Instagram became a Snapchat Plus. The reason you went to Snapchat, which was the fun filters, you could do that on Instagram plus more. So why would you need a platform like Snapchat? So I think Snapchat died very quickly because of that. But you see other niche platforms as well, come and go because they aren't able to evolve, but also they aren't able to monetize. They aren't able to really offer a compelling value proposition. So I speak a lot to the Snapchat representatives in South Africa, just from a media buying perspective. So they come through to the company and they say, "Hey, we've got this great idea. You could, buy a sponsored filter for your brand, and this is how you engage with people." And I haven't been compelled enough to actually test out Snapchat because if I've got, for example, 100 rand to spend on a campaign, I could do something very effervescent on Snapchat, but I could do the exact same thing on another platform, but maintain that audience, or have a richer audience experience. My 100 rand is going to go to the other platform. So I think that was the challenge with Snapchat. And what's interesting now as well is you're starting to see it with TikTok, where the Facebook brands like Instagram are now trying to duplicate TikTok's interface, what makes TikTok special. in order to make it appeal to a wider audience. And that might be the death of TikTok.
Wow. So, okay, folks, you heard it here first. The death of TikTok. What a term. But also talking about social media and its evolution, how it's become so ubiquitous with our lives. Many people do not even imagine a world without social media. A lot of, shall we call them, oh, I'm a millennial myself. I don't know why I want to ostracize them. But a lot of them cannot imagine a world where we came back home and we did something such as watch cartoons for like 2 hours and then did something else instead of coming home and going on your TikTok and watching vines of Slay Queens or whatever they're called. So, what is the perspective that you hold, Brother MJ, on, shall I say, disconnecting from social media every once in a while, taking a break, or not even just taking a break, having that time in your day to just put your phone off and do something in the quote unquote real world and not the quote unquote virtual world? I don't like ostracizing those terms away from each other, but just for understanding's sake, what is your perspective on this? Because I know that you deal a lot with technology, and well, I'm sure that you've read some of these studies on technology and the effect on the human psyche, not just like physically with the waves and radiation and all that sort of stuff, but how Snapchat or Instagram and these things can make you more depressed because you're constantly comparing yourself to someone else. And of course, it depends on your usage of these platforms. It's not that Instagram is inherently evil. There's plenty of good that you can do with Instagram or with any other platform. But if the average person is just doing it to compare how pretty they look to someone else who's using 10 filters, then obviously this sends their mental health into a spiral. So what's your take on disconnecting?
So I wouldn't necessarily say let's have a discussion around disconnecting from technology, but philosophically, the discussion we should be having is, what does moderation mean? And how do you ensure that everything you do in moderation? Like, for example, right now you're taking a sip of water, and you know, water is great for us, right? We need water in order to survive. But if you drink too much water, or you drink an excessive amount of water, that's bad for your health. So often what we do is we talk about disconnecting from technology, and the pejorative idea behind that is that technology itself is the problem, as opposed to saying our self-control is where we need to consider. Because no matter what you do, you could, you know, step away from technology completely, and you could maybe just sit and watch a game of cricket. But we can all agree that if you spend 5 days watching a test match continually for 14 hours a day, that is excessive. And you need to disconnect from that. So even though it's not the same as, for example, you know, sitting on social media and scrolling, it really comes down to, how do we ensure that we have a balanced life where we do not indulge in excesses. However, you do raise a really valid point around dopamine and the sort of excitement we get when we're on social media, the sort of validation we get when we're on social media. The truth of the matter is, we've always been seeking validation. As humanity, it's just ingrained in our DNA. The only difference is with social media is it's so much more accessible to find that validation, because all of a sudden we can reach this massive audience past the normal proximity of a room or something like that there. So I could stand right now and I'm engaging with you virtually, but there's still two of us in this conversation, right? If I were to do a conversation where it was a live stream online or we had a bigger audience, all of a sudden that potential for me to get that dopamine and that validation just increases. And that's all it is. We as humanity, we've always sought for validation. We've always thrived on it. It's important because it's part of self affirmation. But all that social media has done is that it's just amplified the potential for it.
Wow, excellent. So, a lot of excellent insights that you've put forth about social media, about the need for moderation and all those things. But let's hone in on something more personal. So, in case you guys did not notice, in which case you need to get your eyes checked, Brother MJ is a really, really huge nerd, and harken back to the opening statement that he made about the Dark Knight and how he introduces himself differently every time he's asked. So if you see behind him, he's got Sonic wearing a Mario hat, which could be deemed as an act of blasphemy by some purists, and some other characters over there. He's got a Goomba and he's got Yoshi over there. So, Brother MJ, you are a huge nerd, and so am I. I might have said that before on this podcast. I'm pretty unique, or at least I like to believe I'm pretty unique in that sense. But could you tell us more about your experience, as I'll chip in as well, about what it's like to be a nerd who is also Muslim, who is very much engaged with his Islamic faith, Islamic tradition, and engaged in the community as well, visibly Muslim according to whatever your definition of that is, but at the same time really passionate about stories, storytelling, and video games, perhaps, and all these other forms of media which actually predated social media, which we have been having a discussion on for so long.
So yeah, I'm a huge gamer. I've actually identify as a gamer, and I think it's important, when we talk about how does one identify themselves, and not to box ourselves in, because there's so many hats we wear at the same time, because human beings, we're complex beings. So if I were to say I'm a gamer, that doesn't necessarily mean I am excluding everything else that I am, but it just means that that's a part of me that I like to share as part of my identity. So yeah, I've been a gamer for over 30 years. I really enjoy it recreationally. So I don't play competitively that much. I often just play some Fortnite with my friends and we have some fun there. But I really enjoy games as a recreational activity. But where I'm really lucky is my wife is also a gamer. So we get to experience a lot of games together, whether it's co-op or she'll be playing a certain game and I'll play the same game later and we can discuss it. So I find a lot of joy in that. But yeah, I've been gaming for over 30 years. And what you see behind me, I'm actually in my son's room at the moment. He's not even 2 yet, so he is 21 months old. And we're trying to impose some of the love of gaming into him so he knows how to identify Mario, for example, and he enjoys some of the other stuff. But obviously, we're not going to push it on him too hard. It's just sort of our wish that one day he might like gaming as well. Hence the Sonic teddy bear behind me. Although I'd be lying, those don't belong to him. I bought those.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's an interesting thing. So to come back to the idea of like identity, how do you exist where you can be a gamer, but you can also be religious in a sense, and have faith. And I think at the end of the day, as long as sort of whatever you're consuming, you believe there's some good in it, and it's not inherently bad for you, whatever it is, then by all means, for me it seems like a very good thing to pursue. It comes back to that earlier point though, it's about moderation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So no matter what you do, and again, what you do within the gamut of what is halal is if you apply moderation, then I think you can balance things very well.
Wow, absolutely beautiful. But what's your contention? Because you talked about identity, and when you are visibly something, oftentimes there's not this responsibility, but there's this expectation that people have that you have to act a certain way. For example, you and I both have sizable beards. So if they caught us, playing Fortnite one night, then a lot of people will be like, Astaghfirullah, what the hell are you doing? This is haram, or something like, or they won't believe that it's haram, but because you have a big beard and you've got longish hair, or you're wearing a thobe, you are dressed a certain way, you look a certain way, then the expectation is that you shouldn't be engaging in certain types of activities, even though they probably do it themselves. But no, because I look visibly different, then I have to do it that way. And also, I've been getting a lot of messages on WhatsApp a lot about, well, I think it's safe to say that perhaps we both disagree on the position of so-called quote-unquote Islamic dressing. And you, by the way, audience, MJ is a very close associate to Sheikh Ismail Kamdar, who's been on this podcast before. And yeah, they're actually friends, and they've got secrets to share about wrestling apparently. But we'll get Sheikh Ismail to defend his position on that later. But anyway, what I was saying is that yeah, so this thing of dressing quote unquote Islamically and these WhatsApp messages kind of reinforcing that message in, and then you've got people like us who definitely identify as Muslim, who want to be part of the Muslim community, but we've got a different dress sense, for example. But we won't shave our beard off, or we won't cut our hair, but we want to do some things, but we don't want to fit into that box. But people would rather box us in because it's easier for them to process. So how do you deal with a dilemma such as this?
Well, firstly, I think the idea of people policing others' bodies and their appearance and things like that, as much as you and I might get a small taste of that because of our long hair. Truth of the matter is, it's unfortunately the case where the women in our community are subject to that much more harshly than we will ever be. So for us, it's largely around if people want us to look a certain way because they have a certain perception of this is what a Muslim looks like. And the problem with having that position is that immediately you start othering others. So you hold them up against what you think the ideal is, and it is such a difficult thing to work with. I remember a few years ago, I was listening to a lecture by an imam from China, and he kept on repeating. He said, think of the Sunnah as in what is it that you can achieve that's universal versus what is it that you can achieve, or what is it that might be difficult for some people to achieve, and how much weight do you put on that? So something like growing a beard, it might come naturally to you and I in terms of
Mm.
genetics, right? So we might be predisposed to having bigger beards just because genetically it works in our favor. But if you made just a big beard in of itself a mark of faith, what you're essentially telling to those who cannot grow a beard, even though they have desire or love to, is that you as yourself are not worthy because you are unable to do this. Yet if you say, what are the other sunnahs that are more universal that don't rely on, for example, genetics to give you an advantage on? Something like kindness. And how do you focus on those sort of sunnahs that are universal rather than putting a value on something that's just physical? And that's really where I spend a lot of my time thinking is what is my value? Is it like, for example, as people say, the length of your dari, or is it on your ability to be compassionate and kind, and really mold that sort of behavior, as opposed to just be lucky for genetics. I mean, this beard itself, I've been growing it now because of lockdown, and I'm lucky. It grows in spite of my efforts. It grows in spite of anything. It just happens to grow. Should I be rewarded for something that's incidental like that? Purely to the extent that it alienates all my other deeds or everything else I do? And I think that's something we really need to check ourselves on. We place too much value on appearance sometimes, as opposed to what are those universal kindness or compassion points that we really need to view. Because at the end of the day, appearance in itself is deceptive,
Mm.
right? I could look a certain way, but my beard itself does not sort of make up for what's in my heart, my thoughts, my intentions, and those are the things that hold value. Because at the end of the day, I mean, if I can look in a certain way, I could have an outward appearance that could tick a box, but if my taqwa isn't there, then all of this is a facade.
Absolutely, but at the end of the day, brother MJ, you are still beard goals for a lot of people, so we'll keep that where it is in its proper place. So, Alhamdulillah, you talked about, the need for working on our character. Because, look, I've met a lot of people with even bigger beards than you, brother MJ, but unfortunately, their character did not inspire me to, for example, go to the mosque or stay longer in the mosque. In fact, if anything, their character inspired me to actually savor the lockdown that we've had because we don't go to the mosque as often. And I know that sounds really, in a way, ridiculous, or it sounds hurtful in a way, but that's the fact of the matter, that the way you carry yourself, the attitudes that you present to other people, that goes a longer way than, for example, growing a beard or wearing a thobe and having the outward appearance of quote unquote what a Muslim is, or in my case, as I often get told, that I look like Jesus. So take that as you will. But the point of the matter is that what's inside you, do you act like the Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him? Do you act in a way that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would be proud to call you his follower? I think you touched on a really important part there. But it doesn't take away from the fact that people like you and me get looks when we enter into a masjid with our hair tied up, for example. I know you've got yours loose. I've actually put up a man bun today. So how do you personally deal with these sorts of instances? Because it is a journey. I mean, as of quite some time now, I've also been paying less attention to stuff like this, because if I'm going to the mosque, I'm going to pray. I'm going to connect myself to my Lord. I'm not going to entertain these people by giving them a fashion show of what they expect to see. If my hair's tied up in the mosque, it's my business, all right? If my hair's longer than yours, it's my business. At least I'm praying. That's for me to deal with. But I'm sure that you've also had your own set of experiences getting into a mosque and having all eyes on you. So how did you personally feel in that journey? What are some steps that you take to mitigate those negative experiences, so to speak?
I think it used to hit me a lot more when I was younger, in terms of, and again, everything we talk about, it's interesting how circular it is, right? Because it comes back to a few
Yeah,
key points.
absolutely.
And part of why it affects you, and I spoke about this earlier, is that need for validation, that need to feel like you belong. But again, if I just recalibrate myself and say, what's my intention for coming through? Am I clear in my intention? And does my support network support whatever I do? Then you start saying, what is the value of a stranger's opinion versus others? Now, I'm not by no means saying dismiss haters, right? Because even haters themselves, even though we like to say haters gonna hate, haters gonna sometimes have constructive criticism. But if all they can come up to you and say, listen, your hair looks like a woman's hair, and because they have this weird sense of masculinity and what it means, and it doesn't gel with them, but they're not actually giving you constructive feedback, then I'm like, but what's the point? Whereas I've had instances in the masjid where someone will come to me and said, I've noticed when you pray you do this. Talk to me about it. Let me know why you do this versus that, and then we can have a discussion on madhab, or we can have a discussion on posture, and that for me is more constructive as opposed to saying your hair is so long, you look like a girl. So growing up, so I've had long hair now for about 13 years or so, and at one point my hair was very long. So it's an interesting dynamic. But I think where I was quite lucky is because my immediate support network, as in my family and my friends and sort of those who know me, were always very supportive of whatever I did. It allowed me to overcome the opinion of strangers very easily, to the point where I'm so comfortable with myself nowadays, in terms of I'm quite self-aware of myself and I'm quite happy with myself, as in I understand and recognize my flaws. I understand and recognize my own sort of nafs and my own difficulties in faith, that is okay. If someone was to have an opinion, peace be upon you, it's okay. It doesn't affect me anymore. But I also see how it manifests with others. Like as a kid, if I'm in the masjid and I see someone else coming to pray, but they're not wearing a hat or topi or something like that, there, some of the elders would look down at that person, or be like, oh, you're trespassing on a fundamental of faith. And what that does is it purely alienates. It pushes people away. It never ever has that effect of bringing people closer, of accepting people. And I think part of that is also a lot of us grew up very insular. In South Africa, because of the legacy of apartheid, there was a lot of insularity where communities were either forcefully put together in spaces where you look like your neighbor, and there's only similarity in terms of race, or people will then congregate around certain things for comfort. So you'd want to have a community around a masjid, and it so happens that community, everyone looks like you. Although, alhamdulillah, because of globalization, because of our ability to go out and break out of the insularity, we're starting to see that our masjids are becoming a lot more multicultural. We're starting to see a lot more different, flavors of Islam emerge, and that's only a good thing for us to break away from the insularity. But with that comes our baggage and our idea that you're supposed to look a certain way, and if you don't look a certain way and tick all these physical appearances, that for some reason you're not as worthy. And I think that for me is important, a shift away from that in terms of actually appreciating the beauty of Islam.
Wow, mashallah, you put it very maturely, definitely more mature than me. I mean, you said you've been gaming for 30 years. That's longer than I've actually been alive. Yeah, but yeah, I was going to say that as opposed to me who would just start World War III over something like this, you handled it very maturely. So definitely some notes for me to take in. So Brother MJ, you noted that you're living the nerd's dream in that you're also married to another nerd, another gamer, which a lot of people have been fantasizing over since they were children, that I'm going to have a wife who also shares my interests and stuff like that. So I guess you could say that you're very lucky in that manner, alhamdulillah. But as a nerd, a gamer, a movie enthusiast who is also now a parent, what are some things, besides imposing gaming somewhat on your child, what are some things that you do as a parent to make sure that in this very confusing world that we live in today, with all these talks of sexual politics and gender politics and all these confusing things that if we get into them here, we'll be here for another 2 hours. How do you navigate this? How do you carry your child? How do you mold your child into being a Muslim who is also not afraid of their individuality or their identity? What are some practical tips? Because I think of this a lot, actually, because I don't know about you, but in Botswana, and I'm guessing in South Africa it's like this as well. After school, we used to go to madrasa or maktab, whatever you call it, and then read Quran or something. And that happened for until I got to high school, when I had to move towns and stuff like that. So now that I think about it, if I'm going to have a child, I'm not married, but if I'm going to have a child tomorrow, I'm not sure I'm 100% comfortable with something like that, because although they get to learn the Quran and how to read Arabic, that's great. But the other things, as you mentioned, for example, that we've evolved out of this, you need to wear a hat, you need to wear a thobe 24/7, or we have to look like XYZ. We've evolved out of that, and to make your children go through the same thing again isn't the most appetizing thing. So how do you navigate as a nerdy parent in the 21st century?
Mm. I must say, so this has sort of thrust itself quite close to my heart because we're now looking for a playgroup for my son. So he's going to be 2 in January, and we really want him to start socializing with other kids, because there's a lot of value in that. There's a lot of value in play. There's a lot of value in sharing, in which he's not exposed to right now as an only child. And part of this journey with us is also trying to understand what sort of environment do we want to expose him to. Do we then want to go through what we went through, where the environment itself, it was a good environment from an Islamic ethos perspective, but it was filtered through an Indo-Pak system. It was filtered through an insular system that never had a lot of diversity in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of interests. Because if you put a whole bunch of middle class Indian Muslims together, sure, you get some sense of unity and community, but it also has the potential and the negative potential to become quite insular. And I'm so conscious of that with him, where I want him to be able to learn and play with other kids of other cultures, but at the same time have this understanding of what the tenets of Islam is. So I'm constantly balancing that in terms of, like, next year, do we go for the safe and easy option of putting him in a place where there's others that look like him, and the kids all sort of have the one way of looking at it, or do we look at creating a new space for him? And I think maybe that's a little bit arrogant to say, to create a new space, because the truth of the matter is, just like I'm dealing with this struggle in terms of how do I let my son, express his individuality, understand the world, but also have some form of foundation in Islam. I'm sure there's other parents just like me who are out there who are struggling with this, who have perhaps the same, let's call it hesitation, or the same concerns. And really the opportunity now is, how do we find each other and make sure that while the principles are important, we don't necessarily go down the same route we went, where it becomes adherence to perhaps physical manifestations or appearance, or adherence to a certain thing, but very close-minded to other things. So I was quite inspired a few years ago when I read Tariq Ramadan's Radical Reform, and the idea that somehow or the other, because we went so literal with a lot of the explanation and the understanding, we lost a lot of the essence of the faith, like the beauty of the faith. Like sometimes we would focus so much on, for example, the length of your pants, as opposed to saying, what was the essence of it? The essence of it is, back then, if your pants were really long and it was dragging on the floor, it was pride. Often now we would, wear our pants above our ankles with pride. So the essence is completely lost. We've lost that part of it, but we've kept the physical attributes of it. And I think about that a lot. I think about which aspects of my faith is something that's just ritual for ritual's sake, as opposed to what really makes sense. And for me, faith makes sense when it resonates with my heart, and not just because you have to do this because. And I really believe that the beauty of our faith is that we should question, we should reflect, we should ask. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in the Quran many times, to reflect. And if I don't actually take that part of it, and I just sort of prescribe to what others have to find, that's going to be a challenge. And I'm going to then sort of push that onto my child. And he wouldn't have benefited from having a parent who's navigated this and says, son, here's what it is, but I want you at an earlier stage to then navigate yourself, to learn yourself, to understand that there's difference of opinion, to understand that what you are today is not maybe what you're going to be tomorrow, and that's okay. Not just to say, yeah, this is a strict adherence to what you do. Part of what I saw growing up is that there was such reverence for the Hanafi madhab, for example, is that if you see someone reading within a different madhab, you sort of look down on them a little bit. Now, I'm not sure how much I'm projecting, but growing up, because if everyone around you is Hanafi, it becomes default, it becomes status quo. So if someone else is reading within a different madhab, you sort of you don't treat them as equal but different. You treat them as other, and maybe not as straight on the path as you are. And I really want my child to move away from that.
Very insightful. Talking about the Hanafi madhab, it's actually quite funny. My dad's also Hanafi, and I also grew up within the Hanafi madhab. I think most Muslims did in Botswana as well, because in a way, if you look at my episode with Sheikh Ismail Kamba, we talk about a lot of this, cultural baggage and stuff. It's funny that my dad, when he first saw people reading in the Shafi style, which is like, they have their hands on their chest, literally. So then he used to think, hey, these guys must have learned how to pray from their moms, and they never grew out of that because that's a woman's way of praying. So I thought that was quite funny at the time. But then, when you grow up in a more multicultural environment compared to your parents, because I think Botswana's Muslim population also skews more towards those of Indian or Indo-Pak origin, myself included. But myself being someone who grew up in a more multicultural environment, I'm able to appreciate difference more. And just to be pedantic, what about the worst nightmare where, what if your son, for example, becomes a pseudo, I don't know, Salafi, everything is haram sort of guy when he becomes a teenager and condemns you to the fire because you've got all your PlayStations and all that kind of thing? How would you navigate something like that? Because we all went through that sort of phase as well, and it's kind of inevitable, although we don't know how it's going to manifest with your son. So how would you navigate something like that? Sure, you don't want your son to be your clone. At the same time, you don't want him to be a nutcase as well. So how do you navigate something like that?
And I think so that's obviously a very plausible scenario that would happen. Where a child would look at the practice of a parent and either disregard them or become hostile towards them. And if I look back and I reflect on what I shared with you earlier around what are the principles I want to sort of embed in my child, and if that principle is compassion, if that principle is respect, if that principle is respecting difference of opinion and those sorts of things, as opposed to driving into my child the fact that you need to wear a thobe, or you need to do this from a physical manifestation, or you need to learn how to use a miswak or whatever it is, then for me, I'm hopeful that even if he does have a phase where he disregards what we as parents do, he can still do that in a very respectful manner. Because at the end of the day, he understands that respect and dialogue and discussion is more important than just pure condemnation. And I'm not saying that in his heart he doesn't have to feel that this is wrong, but in the terms of how he approaches us, if I've instilled in him some level of respect for diversity or whatever it is, not just respect me because I'm older than you, but respect me because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as humans, then I'm hopeful that those fundamentals would still be at play, even though there might be something that is disregarded. And again, I see this happening all the time. I mean, even with my folks and some of their practices, I often have to, even if I don't perhaps personally believe in something, I'll always make sure that I'm always respectful of them. And I can always dialogue with them. I can always discuss things with them. I can always share, this is how I feel, but I completely respect you, mom and dad. Because at the end of the day, it's not my place to decide their yaqeen or their faith, or to even condemn it or to judge it, because I don't know what brings them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't know what is meaningful for them. And I don't know the sense of the sincerity that I'm tackling. And sometimes, we get so enthralled and caught up in dogma. And again, it comes back to the idea I spoke about earlier about our need to other people and how toxic that is sometimes. It becomes a case where no matter what you believe in, if you are disrespectful to your parents, you are going against the Quran. It's as simple as that. The Quran clearly states, do not even say oof to your parents. So you might hold or harbor opinions that are different, or you might feel so passionately that what they're doing is wrong or misguided or whatever it is. And that's fine, but there's clear direction in the Quran. Don't disrespect them, don't hurt them. And if we are going to hurt them for the sake of being right, what is the value of what you're saying?
Wow, very, very profound, mashallah. So, just to start winding down, inshallah, we've been through a lot, brother MJ. But just to kind of hone in more on your personal experience and stuff like that, is it true you used to have a show called Mufti Gaming on CII?
I did. How did you find out about that? That's an interesting part of my history. Yeah.
I think I was reading it on Accidental Muslims when your episode with them came on. I think. I could be wrong on that. But hey, guys, you thought Mufti Abu Layth was controversial. Check out Mufti Gaming right here. So yeah, could you tell us how you ended up on? I mean, CII it's what you make of it. In some instances, they can be hyper conservative, if I can use that word, and in other instances, they're actually quite open minded for that sense. I mean, I know some people actually condemned CII and Radio Islam and all these other radio stations in South Africa because they had the woman's voice, which was aura and all that, that whole controversy. But how did you end up on CII with a show like Mufti Gaming, and what was that about? Because by that time I actually tried looking for it on CII. I couldn't find it. And how did you end up doing something like that?
Hmm. So yeah, it's I think it'll be difficult to actually find the individual episodes because it was part of a larger magazine show that happened at the time. So there was a slot on Saturday evenings, and I had a mini slot within that. So it wasn't its own sort of dedicated thing. I was one of the weekly contributors to a larger show, and I did it for about 4 or 5 months, I believe. And at the time, so this was maybe about 3 or 4 years ago when I used to do it, it really was about demystifying the idea of, what a video game is, because I feel we need to have open, constructive discussions around the media that our kids consume, open, constructive discussions around pastimes, because otherwise you fall into the trap of not really understanding what your kids are consuming and just making an opinion based on what you heard in the media or whatever it is. So a lot of my sessions when I was doing the Mufti gaming stuff on Channel Islam was around talking about games that are good for families to play. Games with content that is suitable for a child. I would give tips to parents around here's how you can help limit or moderate how much gaming time your child has. Here's the different apps that you can install. For parents as well, it was also educational. It's for them to understand that even though this is gaming, it's not necessarily just for kids. You have games that appeal to a wide spectrum of people. So telling parents, don't just dismiss what your child is playing. Get involved with them. Understand what it is. You don't want a 9-year-old child playing Grand Theft Auto 5.
Mm.
Things like that there. And I think sometimes because we dismiss it and say, oh, it's just a game that the child is playing, we don't put as much effort into understanding what are they actually consuming. Is it appropriate for their age? Is it appropriate for them to see this? And we dismiss it. Yet we spend a lot more scrutiny on other things. So we wouldn't want a child to watch a very violent movie, but often we'll let them play a very violent game. And that's what my slot really was about. It was about talking about here's the family friendly games. Let's actually talk about games. It's not this big unknown monster in the hills that you need to be terrified about. Empower yourselves. And also for parents, here are some tips. Get involved. If your kids are playing, play with them, understand what they're doing, take an interest in it. Because alhamdulillah, there's so many games these days that just exude creativity and really celebrate it. And I think kids are becoming so creative because of the games they're playing, certain games like Minecraft and things like that. We really need, as parents, to understand what they're playing and to not dismiss it. Because I think there's a great opportunity for development within gaming, but also there's a great opportunity for us to educate ourselves so that we as parents make informed choices around it. And that's really what that talk show was about. Unfortunately, it got cancelled after about 8 or 9 episodes. I think maybe a lot more people started listening and they were like,
Mm.
not for us. But shukr, I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And while it lasted, it was great fun. And I do hope that at least a few people who heard would have benefited from those messages.
Wow, insightful. But talking about dismissing certain things, I'm sure that you wouldn't be of the opinion that we don't dismiss a video game just because it's GTA, for example, because it's rated 18 plus or something. Some games are tailored for adults, such as you and me. So how would you, for example, play a game? I don't know how much you are into GTA and all that stuff, but an adult game while you still have your son running around somewhere in the house. Do you hide your PlayStation 4 somewhere in your room or something like that? How do you deal with that? playing a game that's exclusively for adults. Because, I mean, if you're going to tell me that I should stop playing Assassin's Creed, which is all about murder and stuff, by the time I have a child, I don't know if I'm going to be able to follow through with that. So, how would you deal with it?
So for me, I play those sorts of games after hours when he's asleep, and I make complete peace with that. So I don't expose him to that sort of content when he's around, for various reasons, because we know the impact that media has on child psyche. And I'm saying media broadly. I'm not just saying video games. Sometimes video games is used as a scapegoat, but it really is all media. It's why in South Africa, 20 years ago, the movies that were for adults, like RoboCop or something like that, it used to be called 2 to 18. That was the classification system. And then all of a sudden, like about 15 years ago, they realized, hey, hang on, between the ages of 0 and 2, you still get affected by what you consume, by what you see. So now movies like that there, which are like hyper violent, are just straight 18. It's no longer 2 to
Mm.
18. So if you have any South African listeners, you'd be familiar with that old classification system in the cinema. Similarly, if there's something I want to consume that I don't want to play around him for whatever reason, I simply will wait till he's asleep, and that's the time I will game. Or if he is involved in something else, we have quite a strict policy in our house where the content we have playing in the evening, or the content that we have playing while he's around, is always child safe. Not necessarily kids shows, but it's stuff where we know it's not going to have a very negative impact on him. So right now we watch a lot of Shark Tank, and we love that show, the American show, where entrepreneurs come and pitch ideas, and venture capitalists try and bid for it, and that's really safe content for the evening. So we sometimes play that in the evening, but we also, the stuff that we want to watch, my wife and I want to watch, that might have a lot more violence or whatever it is, we just wait till he's asleep, and then we watch it, and that's how we get around it. So I'm not consuming as much as I used to before, but I'm okay with that because I've got such joy with him that all that other stuff doesn't matter. So I'm very okay with gaming, especially the violent stuff that I play, between the hours of 9 o'clock at night and midnight. And that's what I've done. I've just shifted my time to play.
Excellent. And talking about time, could you tell us what a typical day of MJ Khan looks like? Well, not just in the quarantine and lockdown conditions, but of you, who is someone who consumes a lot of pop culture, a lot of movies, a lot of video games. How do you balance all of this? And you mentioned back then with the Accidental Muslims podcast how you used to, I don't know if you were married back then. I think you were, but you used to play Rocket League with your friends like Friday to Saturday morning, something along that line. So, what does a typical day look like for you? Because personally, I've been a bit lazy to play video games of late. I don't know why, but I started the DLC for Metro Exodus and never got around to finishing it. I don't know why I'm lazy to play. I don't know. At the moment, I just want to watch anime more or something, and that's not necessarily bad. But I would love to play more, but I've got other things to do. So how do you balance all this? Because games these days, it's like investing in a TV series. I mean, if you want to play, for example, Breath of the Wild, you're looking at, I don't know, a whole month's worth of sinking into that whole world, or Skyrim's even worse, and stuff like that. So maybe open world games are not your niche, but what does a typical day look like for MJ Khan?
Hmm. So it's interesting that you bring up Breath of the Wild. I really enjoyed that. I played it about 3 years ago. I probably sunk about 70 hours into it. But again, it's not like before. I think, before I was married, before I had a lot more work commitments and things like that, I had much more time to game. Because essentially at the end of the day, you choose what you do with your time. And then I just choose to invest a lot of that time in gaming. Uh, but nowadays I find that I'm a lot more selective about what I play. So previously I would just play anything, and I would try and play as many games as possible, see what I like, see what I don't like, and if I started a game, I would finish it. I'm a lot more protective of my time these days, simply because I have so much less time. So very, very sort of considered about what it is that I do play. So I tend to play only, the titles that I enjoy, and I've also made peace with, if I don't enjoy a title, I stop playing it. So you mentioned Metro Exodus. I enjoyed the previous Metro games, but when I played Metro Exodus now, I played about 4 hours, and then I decided, you know what, I'm not going to actually finish this. Deleted it, moved on, and that's something new for me. To be able to accept that I can leave things incomplete. I'm fine with that. In terms of the day in my life, I do spend a lot of my time doing work related things, and I enjoy it. I love my job. So I spend a lot of time trying to be better at my craft, trying to build frameworks. And because with my job, it's span across a lot of countries, I might have different needs at different times, purely because of time zones. So we have a lot of activity in the United States, which means that some of my work gets shifted to the evening, and I sort of balance my day out like that. I'm also delegating to my team members to make sure that it's not as intensive as it used to be, so I've got a bit more balance. Yeah, so my day will start. I try and get a bit of work done in the morning, but now because I'm working from home, I try and spend some time with my son as well. I really enjoy it. So, like right now, I put in some buffer time. So as soon as this podcast is done, I get to sit with him for about 15 to 20 minutes, have lunch with him, and then I've got my next meeting at 12:30. So so I tend to put that in. I tend to insert those times because that's what I enjoy doing. And work for me is really, it's not about, the traditional 8 to 5. It's what do I need to get done? How do I ensure that I'm fair in terms of my time to my wife, my time for myself, my time to my son, and my time to my employer? And just try and balance that. The truth is, you never ever get it 100% right. But if you're constantly striving to make sure that you have enough time for everything, and you're fair to everything, you don't just accept things and say, yeah, sure, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this, and you're not hard on yourself. You tend to make it work out. So yeah, a typical day of my life, I'm probably spending about 10 to 11 hours sort of doing work related things, and then I just balance the rest of my time around family and my responsibilities and what I have to do.
Excellent. And you mentioned 12:30. That's not too long from um, right now when we're doing this recording. So we'll wind down with a few rapid round questions if you so allow. So, okay, what's your favorite gaming series or game?
Gaming series has to be Super Mario. I think it's an absolutely unbelievable franchise. This year celebrating 35 years, and I still play the original Super Mario Brothers at least once a year. So the original that came out, in 1985, I still play that quite often. I think there's just something beautiful and fun about the Mario series that I love. In terms of games I really enjoy, as in have a meaningful impact on me, I think Grand Theft Auto 5 had a great story. I was emotionally invested in that. The original Red Dead Redemption back in 2010, I thought very powerful storytelling, and I appreciate that. And Legend of Zelda, I enjoyed that franchise a lot.
Excellent. And still on video games, your opinion on Assassin's Creed and the way it's been going for the last couple of entries? Because that's my favorite franchise, just saying.
So I've played every single mainline Assassin's Creed game. I love the franchise. I think they faltered a lot when they introduced the naval stuff in Assassin's Creed 3. So for me, that was a misfire. I think Assassin's Creed Unity and Syndicate were terrible. And I absolutely love Origins and Odyssey. So I've pre-ordered Valhalla. I'm looking forward to that launching next month. I'm a huge fan of Assassin's Creed. I love the first Assassin's Creed game. So this was released, I think, back in 2007, purely because, it was interesting. It dealt with Templars and assassins, and there was Al-Quds, and you could see the masjids and things like that. So that really appealed to me. And then in Assassin's Creed
Yeah.
Revelation with Istanbul, sort of having playing the game and then visiting that city, that was lovely. And then it sort of dipped. So I didn't like Unity. I didn't like Assassin's Creed 3. I didn't like Rogue or even Syndicate. But my love really reignited with Odyssey and Origins. So I'm playing Odyssey at the moment. I'm about 70 hours in, but I'm taking my time. But yeah, love the franchise. I think it speaks to me from just the mechanic perspective, and I think it's evolved so well over the years.
Excellent. And talking about Istanbul, your opinion on Ertuğrul? I know the fan base can be cancer, but on the show itself.
So interestingly enough, I'm on a review video that TRT World did a couple of years ago when Ertuğrul really blew up globally and became this huge global phenomenon. So I contributed to that, and until this day, I get people messaging me and saying, "Hey, MJ, I saw you in this Ertuğrul thing." So personally, I struggle a bit with the series purely because it's a bit slow paced. I think there's some of the mechanics a little cheesy, like the combat. I think there's just too much use of slow motion, and I also struggle a bit with sort of series that have subtitles. Because I like to second screen things a lot. I like to be on my phone and doing things and having TV in the background because I tend to multitask very well. And it's difficult to do that with Ertuğrul because you have to be reading everything, right? Otherwise, you're going to miss it because, I don't speak Turkish. So So that for me was a bit of a challenge. So I ended up dropping off quite early in the show. My father-in-law is a huge fan, so I'll still talk to him about it and get a sense. And I really love that. I love for him, there's this deep sense of representation and a proud representation that he can get from a sense of identity from a show like that. For me, I tend to consume shows like, I'm not sure whether you've watched Rami,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is on Hulu. Yeah. So I love that. I resonate a lot with that show because it really does unpack the complexity of just being a Muslim, like being flawed. Like not everything is a simple cookie cutter. Gone are the days of like little mosque on the
Mm.
prairie where you can wrap a bow on it and it's all resolved nicely within 20 minutes. Rami, I think, deals with the issues that we sort of deal with, the complexities of life, the complexities of being a flawed being, trying to be good, but knowing, you know, you're not good. And so I resonate a lot with that more than I say something like Athurul. But I appreciate Athurul for what it is. It's just, it's not for me. I tend to find it very difficult to watch a lot of it.
Okay, makes sense. Makes sense. So based on that, I'm assuming you're not someone who's into subtitled anime either, as in with the original Japanese with subtitles, because that's personally how I prefer it. But I don't want to start a sub versus dub war. But I think you're on the dub side just to be safe.
Well, it depends. It depends on the show. So if it's something that's packaged really well and it's short and you can consume it easily, like Ninja Scroll, then I'll watch that. Ninja Scroll is like 10 episodes and then it's done. Earthroll is like, what's it, like 60, 70
Yeah.
episodes per season, 5 seasons. That's a commitment of notes. I mean, I probably spent more time watching that than it took me to get my degree. So it really is about, I can understand subtitles if it's very short bursts, like if I'm watching
Mm.
something like Narcos and everyone's speaking Spanish, so you read the subtitles. But again, it's like 10 episodes, it's done. Arturo is just it's overwhelming in the amount of content there.
All right, cool. And then favorite movie, or shall I wanted to phrase it like this. Which movie really spoke to you as a Muslim nerd in South Africa?
Geez, well, the movie that spoke to me as a Muslim nerd is probably Four Lions, Riz Ahmed, 2010 release. I think that was a great movie back in the day. I'm not sure whether you've watched it. Have you watched
No,
Four
I have not.
Lions?
So don't spoil it.
Mm, no, I won't spoil it all, but try and get it if you can. It's a very look. I'm not gonna say more actually. Anything you say about that movie is a spoiler. So Four Lions definitely resonated with me a lot. My favorite movie of all time is The Lord of the Rings: Two
Oh,
Towers.
awesome.
So specifically in that trilogy, the second movie, there was just something about it that I loved, and I mean, ever since it released 18 years ago till today, it still stands as my favorite movie.
Excellent, excellent. So, brother MJ, we've been going according to my recording software for about 1 hour. Thank you, Jazakallah khairan, shukran jazilan, for coming out and making time out of your schedule of being a Muslim nerd and being a father, a husband, and a marketer at Sasol. One last question out of interest. Does anyone ever complain about the length of your hair when you go for a job interview, for example?
No, I think I guess I do well at interviews or whatever it is, but it's never been brought up. Often someone will tell me that the length of my hair is probably going to limit my career aspirations, but I'm there to prove them wrong.
Yeah, excellent, excellent.
It's never held me back. I mean, as much as I've heard those sorts of statements, in my previous vacancies, Alhamdulillah, it's never ever. I guess once people get to know me and they sort of understand where I'm coming from and they see what I can offer, the hair's the last thing that's on the table.
MashaAllah. I mean, it might be slightly different from me in the legal field. No one said anything yet. It was just once someone was asking me about my beard. They didn't request that I shave it off or anything, but they were just asking about it. So I don't know. With the law field, there's still this perception that you need to be quote unquote conservative. I don't even know what that means
Mm-hmm.
because once upon a time that meant being clean shaven. But a lot of my lecturers who are from the UK, white men, have bigger beards than me. So I guess that's also changing for the better. But anyway, I was just curious about that because inshallah, maybe soon I'll be moving back to an office setting, but it's something to consider, I guess. But thank you very much, brother MJ, for coming on, making the time out to do this. I hope that we can work together many times in the future and maybe have a wrestling match between you and Sheikh Ismail Kamdar, since that's what you both love doing.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. And again, just a reminder to you, you and I are there to break the mold. We're not there to fit the mold. So I think, just be you, be comfortable with whatever you do. And if we have this light in us that's going to shine regardless. And often if people have a perception based on how you look, it's then the opportunity for you to shift those barriers and to break them. So, wish you all the best. Thank you so much for having me on this show. It's such an honor to be here. It really is. And I appreciate the time that you spent with me. And I'm looking forward to when this drops.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll be notifying you, inshallah. So, dear viewers, you heard it from the man himself, Mufti Abu Layth. You've got nothing when it comes to controversy on Mufti Gaming right here. So, Jazakallah khairan for everyone who tuned in, who had the time to watch this and to listen to it. We hope you learned something. Remember the message of self-authenticity. Be yourself. There's no need to censor yourself for the sake of the opinions of others, as long as you know it's making you happy. And for us as Muslims, that you know it's not in contradiction to the commands of Allah and in the Quran and the Sunnah, then there's no reason to be ashamed of doing it. This has been your host, Moss, from The Scholar and the Student. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum. Peace.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Well, you reached the end. Well done. I guess I'll give you a little bit of a prize by reminding you to like, share, and subscribe to our relevant channels. Follow us on all our social media platforms. If you're using Apple Podcasts, do leave us a 5-star rating. And if you think we've earned it, we'd appreciate a one-time donation on Ko-fi or a longer pledge on Patreon. Until next time, stay blessed. Assalamu alaikum.